My name is Norma Levy, and I am the president and founder of New Plaza Cinema. Today, we look forward to a very lively discussion about the magnificent 1941 film Citizen Kane, starring, co-written and directed by Orson Welles. And now I'm pleased to introduce the host for this talk back, the author and film historian, Max Alvarez. Max, please begin.
Thank you so much, Norma, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a reminder that we are going to be recording our session today for eventual posting on the New Plaza website. Citizen Kane, where does one even begin to discuss such an astonishing theatrical feature debut by a 25-year-old director from Kenosha, Wisconsin? But had a biography been written about Orson Welles in the years leading up to his making Citizen Kane, the material would have been enough for a massive, massive book. Clearly, his experience on the New York stage and on the New York radio, his extraordinary cultural contributions would have been more than enough for several lifetimes of any other artist. Arriving in Hollywood 2 years before Kane came out, we have Welles revolutionizing commercial cinema, a task that Hollywood in many ways never forgave him for doing. So we're going to be talking Kane today. We have our two special guests with us. Daniel Cahill is off as usual. We'll be discussing the cinematic look to Citizen Kane. But Stephen Smith, who gave an extraordinary talk on Orson Welles and his historical Halloween Eve radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, which was 3 years before Kane. Steve gave that wonderful talk for us on Wednesday. He is back. He will be joining me shortly to discuss Citizen Kane. I have a little bit of a Kane memory that I want to share, but first of all, I would like to begin with the original theatrical trailer. It's quite remarkable that a Hollywood studio, first of all, would have given such artistic license to an unproven director of feature films. Orson Welles was not a novice when he directed Kane. He had done some filmmaking work in the 30s, some of which has recently come to light and is quite remarkable. But to receive a two-picture contract from a major studio, granting him any project he wished to make without any interference, extended even to the trailer of Citizen Kane, which, as in the case of everything Orson Welles ever did, was decades ahead of its time. This is not your typical trailer for a big budget Hollywood picture. It's very playful. It's making technological in-jokes as Welles introduces some many new faces that will become established Hollywood actors in the years to come. Stephen showed a portion of the trailer on Wednesday. We're going to take a look at the entire trailer, just under 4 minutes, that RKO released to what must have been a very puzzled mainstream movie-going audience in 1941.
Lights! Give me a light. Thank you. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles. I'm speaking for the Mercury Theater, and what follows is supposed to advertise our first motion picture. Citizen Kane is the title, and we hope it can correctly be called a coming attraction. It's certainly coming to this theater, and I think our Mercury actors make it an attraction. I'd like you to meet them. Speaking of attractions, well, the chorus girls are certainly an attraction, but frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we're just showing you the chorus girls for purposes of ballyhoo. It's pretty nice ballyhoo. But here's some of our real Mercury people. This is the first time you've seen most of them on the screen. Hey, give Joe a little light. Thanks. Now smile for the folks, Joe. Smile. Joseph Cotton, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Joseph Cotton. I think you're going to see a lot of him. Here's Ruth Warwick, whom I know you love. Ruth. Look at the camera, Ruth. We caught Ruth with her hair up. And here's somebody you've all heard on the radio, so I don't have to tell you he's wonderful, Ray Collins. Dorothy Commongore is a name I'm going to repeat. Dorothy Commongore. I won't have to repeat it much longer. You'll be repeating it. And here's George Coulouris, who's a grand actor. I'll say that name again. George Coulouris. Watch it. Here comes Everett Sloane. Look out, Everett. Oops. Everett Sloane, ladies and gentlemen, he isn't necessarily a comedian. And here's one of the best actors in the world, Agnes Moorehead. I've said a lot of nice things, but Erskine Sanford deserves some more. Erskine Sanford. So does Paul. Paul Stewart, everybody. Citizen Kane is a modern American story about a man called Kane, Charles Foster Kane. I don't know how to tell you about him. There's so many things to say. I'll turn you over instead to the characters in the picture. As you'll see, they feel very strongly on the subject.
Charles Foster Kane is...
Sure, he started the war. But do you think if it hadn't been for Mr. Kane, the United States would have the Panama Canal?
Charles Foster Kane is nothing more or less than a communist.
Kane, governor. Listen, when the voters of this state and Mrs. Kane learn what I found out about Mr. Kane and a certain little blondie named Susan Alexander, he couldn't be elected dog catcher. I'm going to skin Mr. Charles Foster Kane alive.
I'm going to marry him next week at the White House.
Emily, I hear you've been stepping out with Charlie Kane.
Of course I love him. I gave him $60 million.
Well, of course I love him. He's the richest man in America.
But all the girls say about him at first.
But you know, I can't help but admire him.
He's crazy.
He's wonderful.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what you'll think about Mr. Kane. I can't imagine. You see, I play the part myself. Well, Kane is a hero and a scoundrel, a no-account and a swell guy, a great lover, a great American citizen, and a dirty dog. It depends on who's talking about him. What's the real truth about Charles Foster Kane? I wish you'd come to this theater when Citizen Kane plays here and decide for yourself.
Well, today we make such a big deal about Citizen Kane in this country, one of the greatest Hollywood achievements, classic American film. Unfortunately, most Americans stayed away from it in 1941. It did not perform well at box offices. It was originally supposed to open in February of 1941 at Radio City Music Hall. But the music hall got panicked when the Hearst media empire began causing problems. They saw this film as being based on William Randolph Hearst's life and were intent on shutting it down. Hearst and his stooge Luella Parsons attacked the film and Wells in print. A lot of competitive theater circuits panicked and would not book Citizen Kane. The music hall backed off. And eventually it opened 3 months later at an RKO theater in Times Square, the Palace, which had to be converted over to show a motion picture. It then played other RKO theaters where it did very mediocre business. Even in the film colony in Los Angeles, it opened on 2 screens that summer. And within a week and a half, it was down to 1. So much for Hollywood's love of Citizen Kane in 1941. Today, it's this look at a newspaper tycoon is heralded as a masterpiece, a very influential cinematic achievement made by a director who was very eager to embrace and build upon previous film technique, experiments with editing and composition and narrative, a very, very unusual narrative, which we are going to talk more about. But there's also a lot of mythology behind Citizen Kane, and Stephen Smith and I shortly will be discussing that. There's almost been an industry that has cropped up to belittle Wells's contribution to Citizen Kane. There have been HBO TV movies like RKO 281. There was a recent Netflix film called Mank, which came out 2 years ago that Gary and I talked a little about, which basically was denying Wells's contributions to the script, claiming that everything was Herman Mankowitz and that Wells tried to deny Mankowitz co-screenwriting credit, which is not true. But we're going to talk more about that. Certainly, there is a lot of William Hearst's life in this film. I mean, Hearst began, like Charles Foster Kane, on the side of the common man. Then he became more reactionary. He did have a failed attempt at a political career. He did profit from the Spanish-American War in 1898, like Charles Foster Kane. He built a huge media empire and watched it crumble. He did have a Xanadu-like fortress, not quite as gloomy, called San Simeon. And of course, he had an actress, mistress, whose career he didn't quite know what to do with. But as we're going to talk about, there were other influences as well. And this is an absolutely remarkable achievement. Before I bring Stephen on, my one Citizen Kane link is, 40 years ago. It's 1982. And I'm going on a tour of the Laird International Studio in Culver City, which had previously, in the 1940s, been one of several of RKO Radio Pictures facilities. Citizen Kane, a lot of it was filmed at that Culver City facility, then known as Laird International in the 80s. And at the time, they had the last surviving silent shooting stage from the silent era. It was made of wood. It had a partially glass, almost greenhouse-like ceiling. And it was used for storage of historic props. And we took a tour of this warehouse. And there were a bunch of crates, wooden crates with wooden slats that had statues inside of them. Those were from Citizen Kane. Within a few years after the Gannett News Organization took over the lot, that magnificent stage was turned into a parking lot. I don't know what became of those props, but that was my connection with Citizen Kane. Now, I would like to have join me Stephen Smith, who I mentioned gave this fabulous Wells talk on Wednesday. He's a 4-time Emmy-nominated documentarian and author who specializes in Hollywood history. He's written biographies on Max Steiner and also Bernard Herrmann. He has produced and written over 200 documentaries for television and other media on films ranging from The Sound of Music to Lawrence of Arabia to West Side Story to the Hollywood pre-code censorship years that I know he's talked about with us before. Needless to say, Stephen, we're thrilled to have you back at New Plaza Cinema.
Thank you, Max. It is a delight to be here as always. I'm glad that so many people joined us today. And yes, when I was writing my biography of Bernard Herrmann back in the 1980s, I had the pleasure of interviewing a number of people who worked on this film since Bernard Herrmann wrote the score for Citizen Kane. It was his very first film score, just as this was Wells's very first real feature film. And our talk today gave me a good excuse to drive into Los Angeles and to UCLA, where the RKO papers are stored, and go back through a good amount of the original production reports and files. Sadly, I can't put them on screen with you, but I made lots of notes from them, so perhaps some of that will work its way into this. But yes, and I've got some images behind the scenes that I thought I could use as we speak, and I'd love this to be a conversation and a monologue. Max, jump in as much as you would like. You mentioned all the misconceptions, or that there are many misconceptions about the movie. They will never stop. They certainly were increased in the early 1970s when Pauline Kael wrote the Citizen Kane book, as if it was the last word on the matter. It was not the last word on the matter. There's a much, much more accurate book about the making of it that you will see in a moment. Not mine, someone else's, that really focuses on the film entirely. But let me, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, and this is the most tedious part of the process, but one nevertheless that I can't escape, is just clicking a few buttons to get this full screen here. I'm almost done. Hang in there. One more to go, I think. Please tell me, does that look like a full screen image? So here we see Orson Welles with Gary Oldman. No, that's actually Herman Mankowitz, the co-screenwriter of Citizen Kane. And it has been proven, I think, by all serious academicians and people who studied the scripts that Wells's involvement in the screenplay was sufficient to merit him his co-writing credit. That's something that just never seems to go away. But Mankowitz, no question, wrote the bulk of the film and overwrote it, and Wells kept refining it and making it more visual. And I'll just go ahead and say that the author, who I think has the best book on the making of Citizen Kane, Robert Carringer, really goes into detail about what Wells's script contributions were.
A fabulous book.
Yes. And yes, absolutely, Charles Foster Kane, if you had to pick one person, it was mostly based on, one would have to say, Hearst. And there was an exhibition, I think it's still up, at the New Academy of Motion Pictures Museum in Los Angeles, where they have one of the original Kane scripts on display. And when I was there, it was open to the page, in which Kane famously replies about "no war here. You provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war." And there's a little note, I think, in Wells's hand saying, Hearst actually said this, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. But there were many other characters that were incorporated into the character of Charles Foster Kane. There was the Chicago industrialist Samuel Insull, who married a much younger woman and built the Chicago Civic Opera House for her to sing in. And similarly, there was Harold McCormick, who divorced his first wife, who was a very prominent woman, Edith Rockefeller, and then focused on promoting what was the unsuccessful operatic career of his second wife. So when it comes to the Kane-Susan Alexander relationship, those were really the influences. And one of the offshoots of the film's release that Wells regretted was that so many people thought that he was depicting Marion Davies, blonde actress, who Wells correctly admired as a gifted comedienne. And so really there's no Marion Davies intent. I believe that there was no intention to depict her in that. Now, Bernard Herrmann said that the influence that people keep missing is Orson Welles himself. And if you watch the movie, certainly the spirit of Welles animates the young Charles Foster Kane, the sense of adventure, of going into something he hasn't done before. If for Kane it's newspapers, for Welles it's making films. The people around him, the cast that surrounds him, it's the cast of the Mercury Theater. And Wells's mother died when he was 9 years old, so he did have a longing for her in that time in his life. His father was an alcoholic from whom he was estranged, and although we don't know much about Kane's father, we see him as a weak and troubled man. And since Welles had this sort of difficult an unfortunate situation with his parents, one of his early guardians was a gentleman named Dr. Maurice Bernstein. So Mr. Bernstein is an homage to a real person in Wells's life. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that Welles was 25 years old when work on Kane began. And in the production reports, I found one of the budgets, an early budget for the film, just before it started shooting, that put the cost at $723,800. It ended up costing $839,727, which is about $18 million today. So RKO got really a very good deal on this movie. It feels much bigger than the cost. And in the production line that I saw, Welles, to direct, produce, co-write, and co-star, received $70,000, which would be about $1.5 million today. So no wonder he was very happy and motivated to make a good film, because not only did he want to prove himself in Hollywood, but his professional life in New York had been lurching between, great success and catastrophe, at least on stage. So this was probably the most stable year he ever had. He was still doing his radio series. He was making this film. Filming began in July of 1940, and I love this still of him because, of course, he would be in character and makeup and then jump onto the platform, and we'll be hearing much more about the cinematographer from Daniel in a moment. But there's the famous quote that Welles later said that the RKO machinery and Kane gave him the biggest electric train set any boy ever had. And while this may not be the biggest set we'll ever see, you certainly get a sense of him up there enjoying the opportunity to find new perspectives and try new things with this film. Well, the filming was not without some drama. It went pretty smoothly, but Wells did suffer an injury in the scene when Kane is chasing boss Jim Geddes down the stairs. Wells fell and he chipped his ankle, so for a couple of weeks he had to direct in a wheelchair, but here we see him pre-wheelchair rehearsing the Mr. Kane number, which of course was also used in that trailer, I think most effectively. And look at Wells's nose, by the way. That is not his real nose. He did not like his real nose or feel that it photographed well, might be the best way of saying it. So in all of his films, sometimes really obviously, he has a fake prosthetic nose on. So you'll see in some of these images his real nose when he's not in character that day and just directing, and then wearing his false nose, which is a very good one. There he is, I think, with his real nose, and a surprisingly tired-looking Joseph Cotten, given that this was his film debut. Cotten was generally very happy making this movie, although he was unhappy that he had to start by playing the old Leland and not the young one, but he dealt with that. And here we see a gentleman in the background that Daniel will tell us more about, Greg Tolland. But again, I think that it's a testament to the makeup in this film, that when you look at these behind-the-scenes photos that are not lit for makeup, because makeup isn't just shot on film the way it looks. Light is very carefully employed to bring out the best in it. I think that the makeup is surprisingly good when you even just see it here in these close shots. So here's Wells post-chipped ankle, directing for 2 weeks in his wheelchair and probably enjoying every moment of people having to bend down and give him food like a lord. And here's one of my favorite stills, because we see him directing the close-ups of Dorothy Cummingore while she's singing the opera Salambo, which I should say Salambo is not a real opera. It is an aria, a single aria written by Bernard Herrmann at Wells's request. And as for why they didn't use a real opera for her to sing, Herrmann would later explain that there was no opera that began with a tremendous musical tumult, curtain goes up, and then you have the soprano singing in a very high range in the very first seconds of it. So they needed something unique to the script, and that's why Herrmann embraced the opportunity to write this piece, Salambo. And when I was going through the production reports, and I wanted to read in detail more about the filming of the opera sequence, I shouldn't have been astonished, but I was. They only shot on a large stage for 2 days, on August 14th and August 16th of 1940. And if you think about it, the whole movie does this extremely well. There are some key establishing shots, sometimes real, sometimes employing a mixture of, Daniel will probably get into that, but rear screen projection or models. But Wells gives us those shots that are wide, but most of the sequence is close-ups. Cummingore in close-up, and Wells in his box, and Cotten in his box. And again, this I think is a brilliant example of how adroit he was at suggesting more than you're actually seeing. Even that great moment where we see the opera debut from Susan's point of view and the curtain goes up, we don't see the audience. They didn't have to have an audience because it's just that darkness and the blinding light hitting her and us. And just a last word on the opera sequence. Bernard Herrmann was very angered when Pauline Kael in her book wrote that the singer was directed to sing badly for this aria. And it's a testament to the kind of detail that Herrmann had and Wells had in their approach, that they didn't have a singer sing badly. They chose they found a young singer named Jean Forward who had a very light soprano voice, and gave her this music that was just simply out of her range, because that's what Susan was. As Herrmann said, if Susan had had no voice, Kane wouldn't have decided, well, I'm going to make you an opera singer. She had to have some voice. It just wasn't a voice adequate for opera. So that's why they found someone who had a nice voice, but just was simply not an operatic singer, and employed her, I think, brilliantly in that way. I have mentioned the makeup. Here we see Maurice Siderman, who was a staffer at RKO. His career rose considerably and deservedly based on this film, and it's fun to see the process of Wells's aging into the oldest version of Kane here in some of these images. And there we see Greg Tolland, cinematographer, who is thinking about how he is going to light this. But again, the makeup is so good in Kane. it amazes me that other films of the time and even well into the 50s, old age makeup or middle age makeup can be so poor, because I think Marie Siderman and team really created a new standard using latex. And speaking of latex, here's the creepiest image I will share with you, but again, really innovative, the kind of thing that Dick Smith would be doing in the 70s with Dustin Hoffman and Little Big Man, or working on The Exorcist. So, like much of this movie, 30 years ahead of its time. And the last material to be shot, according to the production reports that I saw, were those great sequences of all the crates at Xanadu that Max told us about. And Max, I certainly got a chill when you told me that story. That was amazing.
Thank you.
And I think you can just see the glee that Wells has. I'm sure he loved being in these high places that he could not be directing on stage. He loved to use light dramatically on stage, but he couldn't have this kind of point of view shot that he did here. And there he almost looks like a ventriloquist dummy there. But again, this brilliant use of large objects and then extremely intimate shots throughout. And Bernard Herrmann had the decided advantage of being the composer of this film before they even knew they were making Citizen Kane. Once Wells got this incredible offer from RKO as a result of the War of the Worlds broadcast I talked about on Wednesday, Wells got this incredible contract where really the only person he had to answer to was the Breen office, the production code, and I'm sure, and there are other things. I'm sure the film had to be within a certain length, but he had incredible flexibility in terms of who he could hire, and I think that's demonstrated by the fact that he was able to use, rather than one of RKO's staff composers, he brought in a 29-year-old composer from New York who had never worked in film before, Bernard Herrmann, but who had proven himself at CBS to be a great dramatic composer. And Benny's score was so great that he earned an Oscar nomination for it. He lost. The winner that year was Bernard Herrmann for his second film score, a movie called All That Money Can Buy, or The Devil and Daniel Webster, that should be better known. But Herrmann was on set. He had officially 10 weeks to write the score, but he really had months to write the score because he could think of it. And on another occasion, we can talk about how he employed, as he said, a jigsaw puzzle of musical motifs, so that in addition to Kane having a theme that develops, Kane's theme is based on an ancient Gregorian chant of death, because Benny said with typical gravity that the message of Kane is all is vanity. And he writes a theme for Rosebud that we hear at the very beginning of the movie when we see Rosebud. And since I assume you've all seen the movie, the Rosebud is the sled, and he's looking. And so when you see that little globe, you hear the Rosebud theme, and then Benny plays it fortissimo when we see the actual sled. So as he liked to say proudly in his interviews of the 60s and 70s, that he told you what Rosebud was about a minute into the movie, if you were paying attention. And here is the aforementioned premiere, and it was quite an event. Wells by then had left his first wife and was with Dolores Del Rio, an actress best known from the 30s, but who continued to work, of course, for decades after that. This really was, I think, the apex of his life and career. And it's only a shame that after that brilliant trailer he got to make, that RKO could not come up with a more imaginative advertising campaign.
It's terrific. I would have loved to have sat in on the meeting where the sales team came up with that. Please continue.
Exactly. And, as Max alluded to, maybe there wasn't any advertising campaign that could have made this movie popular, because, Hearst did everything he could to kill it. He pretty much did kill it by some people think the career of Dorothy Cummingore, who had played, in his eyes, Marion Davies, even though she's really not. But she had a rather tragic life after this and was a subject of the blacklist, and that's a whole other story. But I don't know that there was an advertising campaign that could have helped made that film a hit. Also, it was a very complex film. Some audience members really hated it when they saw it. It required your attention. It was so different. But it grew on people, let's say, with time. And with that, I'll just leave you. Here's the book that I urge everyone to get, The Making of Citizen Kane by Robert L. Carringer, who also wrote a brilliant for me, last word book on the Magnificent Ambersons. Wells is much more troubled and tragically mutilated follow-up to Citizen Kane. So both of these are must-own books, I think. And if you'd like to read more about the music of the film, as well as all the great Hitchcock films that Herman scored, that's my biography of Herman on the right. Just put 2 R's and 2 N's in the name Herman and my name, and you can probably find it about anywhere. So thank you for letting me share that.
Stephen, that was phenomenal. We have more to discuss, but now we are going to look at the look of Citizen Kane, and we're going to bring Dan Cahill in to share with us his wisdom about the visual look of this remarkable film. Welcome back, Dan Cahill.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to start sharing my screen and getting this all ready. And while I do, I want to make some historical comments about, let's just say, the increased reputation of the film over the decades. Beginning in 1952, a prestigious film magazine from Great Britain called Sight and Sound, published by the British Film Institute, has conducted a poll every 10 years amongst, let's say, people who are knowledgeable about film, critics, historians, scholars, and for 6 decades, Citizen Kane reigned as the best film of all time in that poll, until 2012, 10 years ago, when Vertigo toppled it down to the humble 2nd place. So the next poll results are due out in November. Everybody contact your bookies, place your bets. We'll see what happens. Now, one justification for all of this is the massive contribution of Greg Tolland, the cinematographer, and the fact that Wells was happy to share virtual equal billing with him on the only title card is remarkable and completely unheard of in Hollywood history. Here is Greg Tolland. He was very well known in Hollywood. He had worked for, John Ford. He shot The Grapes of Wrath. He'd won an Oscar for William Wyler's Wuthering Heights. He'd worked with Howard Hawks. And he knew what was going on in the world. And he heard that there was this wunderkind coming in from New York who had carte blanche at RKO. He wanted in on that deal. And so he and Wells struck a nice deal. And part of the deal was that Tolland took Wells aside, legend has it, for a weekend or maybe a little longer, to school him on things like cameras and lenses and lighting, because Wells really had very little experience with motion pictures. And he took him aside because essentially he didn't want to embarrass Wells in front of the crew. So they appear to have had a very strong collaboration. And the sad note is that Mr. Tolland died way too young at age 44 of a heart attack. And there are stories of depression and alcoholism in his life, but we will not dwell on them. I'm going to show you some still frames from the film and try to explain how some of it was done. This is early in the film where one of the researchers is contacting Susan Alexander at the nightclub El Rancho in Atlantic City. And the camera is going to move through this sign, and then it's going to approach the skylight that we see in the background. And right as the camera is getting ready to dive into the skylight, what happens? There is a big flash of lightning, blurring the cut that was made to go into the club. And so the camera was using a little bit of trickery there. Here they pulled it off a bit more smoothly later on in the film. It's basically the same shot, but no lightning. This is a common shot in excellent cinematography films. I think I've commented on it before. The only way you can actually photograph a shaft of light is to put smoke or fog in the room, which is what they did here. And that's one reason why actors sometimes complained about not being able to breathe very well, but it looks cool. This is one of the early uses of deep focus cinematography. And I think we can all understand that it means the deep background where Charlie Kane is playing in the snow and the foreground up to the papers on the table is all in sharp focus. And there are basically two photographic techniques. I'll try not to get too technical, but you want to use a wide angle lens. They traditionally have more depth of focus than a telephoto lens. I think the usual lens they used in this film was a 25 millimeter, and the standard was a 50 millimeter, which photographed things quote unquote normally. The other thing is you want to be able to have the smallest possible aperture, or f-stop, in the lens. That will give you greater depth of field. And that inherently means that you need more light on the scene. Just a little thing that I picked up on here. This is the last time we see Rosebud until after Kane's death. Charlie Kane is using it to beat Mr. Thatcher away. This may be some sort of a clue as to what the significance of Rosebud is in his life. Just saying that. Here is the scene where Kane and Leland come to the Inquirer office for the first time. And I chose this frame because I want you to look up at the ceiling, which is on vast display here. Now, Hollywood studios very rarely had ceilings on them because that's where all the lighting comes from, and often the microphones are dipped from high above. I do remember that the Hollywood director who was my mentor decades ago said that when you're working in a studio system and you know ahead of time that you want a low angle shot, then you have to contact the carpentry department and ask for what he referred to as a ceiling piece. Now, this would probably be something that was inserted over the corner of a room. Here we have the whole room is covered, which means lighting has to come in from the side. You will also note that there is a wall on the far left there. Looks like there's a corner, and there are probably lights hidden behind there. But it's an extra challenge to get the proper amount of light on the scene in order to keep it in deep focus. Once again, this was not easy stuff to relax through. You had to work to get at this stuff. I like this shot. This is the scene where, excuse me, where Kane is developing his declaration of principles. And he moves from the window over to the table to lay it down in front of his colleagues. And Kane's face goes into shadow. Note that Leland and Bernstein are well lit here, but Kane's face is in shadow, which silhouettes him against the bright spot of the ceiling. It's very effective use of the camera. And yes, he's talking, but the darkness kind of pulls us in to look at Kane's face more than the other two guys. Orson Welles seemed to like reflections. We'll see a few more of those coming up later. I just love the fact that he exploited the window to show the dance party going on behind them. Once again, this is massive depth of field. When you're taping focus, you have to go to the window and then back to the actors to measure the true distance of the focus. That's probably too technical, sorry. Here is an example of shallow focus. Nobody cares who the people are in the chairs in the background at the hospital. For all we know, they could be mannequins. We're focusing on Leland talking about Kane. This is the most interesting part of the frame, and they kept the rest of it soft, just so we would watch Jed Leland, played by Joseph Cotten. Here's another favorite shot of mine. This is in the aftermath of the election, and the camera is so low that it looks like it was sitting on the floor. Well, they went further than that. Legendarily, Kane had them cut a hole in the wooden studio floor so that they could photograph the scene from below the studio floor. And you can note here why I know that's the same scene. Look at the makeup and wardrobe on Kane. It's pretty much the same. So they were shooting from about as low possible an angle as you could get in a studio. Another shot that I really love, I just love the composition in this, and Kane as the big boss in the foreground who is rewriting a review that Leland on the right is observing, and way in the back there's Bernstein. It's a lovely balance of three different size shots and three different characters of three different importances in the scene. Once again, deep focus. Here is sort of a traditional thing. When one character has power over another, they can cast a shadow over them. And this is KANE and Susan. You can tell who's in charge here. You can also tell what's gone wrong with their marriage. You couldn't be any farther apart from this person and still be in the same room. Distance is a priority in this film, and the deep focus effect once again. Here we have not only deep focus, but the last days of KANE's empire. Loneliness is perceived here. One man standing alone at the end of the hallway. And here we have the Hall of Mirrors effect, which prefigures one of the most exciting sequences in all of Wells' films, the Hall of Mirrors in Lady from Shanghai. And that's basically it, but I have one more little thing to show you. We all remember this shot of the alternative headline after KANE was defeated. And I just want to point out that there is a very famous, twice impeached, now disgraced former president who was asked in 2017, what is your favorite film of all time? And the LA Times quotes him as saying, Citizen Kane. Now, my conclusion is that Mr. Trump used the film not as entertainment, but as kind of an instruction manual. So that's all I got for you guys. I do want to say in the last few seconds here, I am shocked that the mainstream media has not reported on this connection between Trump and KANE and the fake news headline. I think somebody should be watching and copying us here, and I hope to see it on MSNBC very soon. All that RKO knew to say was, it's terrific. Everybody's talking about it. Clearly, they had no idea what this movie was.
Well, I want to share some trivia. It went into production. It was alternately known during the pre-production and production stage as John Citizen USA and American. Stephen, does that coincide with what you read in those RKO papers?
I didn't see that in the papers because I started with the budgeting and when it was really sort of set to go and not the pre-production. But I've heard that. And yeah, American, I know, was a working title for a while.
Now, Wells, of course, could spin a great yarn, but he said in an interview many years later that his secretary had offered the title "A Sea of Upturned Faces." That's imagine how different cinema would have been had they gone with that title. Daniel was talking about the Greg Tolland cinematography. The also revolutionary aspects of the film is that newsreel, that news on the march satire that opens the film, that was quite revolutionary in the sense that it was deliberately trying to not only satirize contemporary newsreels, but was technically trying to capture the look of older films, something that Hollywood had not done very well. And maybe you can confirm this, gentlemen, but I understand that the RKO newsreel crews helped shoot some of those phony newsreel footages. And I also read, perhaps it was in that wonderful Carringer book, that they scratched the film when they made it, the newsreel reproductions, and they also removed every other frame in order for it to have more of a jerky look.
On some shots, yeah, on the earliest ones. Bernard Herrmann was around. He remembered someone stomping on a piece of the film. I mean, they were just having a great time making it dirty. And in a way, Wells was biting another hand that fed him because Henry Luce was the producer of The March of Time, and Wells had been a participant in the radio version of that, and then it was a newsreel series. So News on the March is clearly The March of Time. And I bet people involved with the real series didn't see that as an affectionate homage. Just somehow it doesn't seem that way. And one last thing about how they put it together, and again, so modern, so ahead of their time. Rather than have Bernard Herrmann score it, which would be the normal way to do it, they took library music. They took pieces of other RKO scores, and they cut it all up the way newsreels are, where the music is always jumping into very different styles and ensembles, because they really wanted to approach it not like a film, but just as if you were making a real newsreel with using all the same methods.
And then almost at the very end, towards the end of that newsreel section, there's the candid footage of the elderly Charles Foster Kane in the wheelchair, photographed with a handheld, probably an IMO camera, which you didn't see in a Hollywood movie. Whenever they were showing a newsreel, it was always a beautifully positioned crane shot, right? And that was very, very impressive as well.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And it actually points to Wells's brilliance at satirizing different forms of filmmaking, because it was only 9 years ago that they located Too Much Johnson, that footage from the unproduced, well, it was only in one performance in Boston, but it was a play Mercury Theater was going to stage based on a William Gillette 1890s farce, and it was supposed to contain a silent movie during certain acts. Wells shot this Max Sennett-like silent homage that was never finished, but the material is extraordinary, and it looks. He really went to the extent to try to capture the look and feel of a silent movie from the 1910s, early 20s.
I agree. Yeah.
And he does it again in Citizen Kane. So he really had an eye for this sort of thing.
He did. It's interesting, that Too Much Johnson footage. I believe it's on YouTube.
It is. They added to the 1 hour version.
I would just say that to me, it foreshadows everything that's great and everything that was tragic about Wells. And that is, he's got a great look. It's full of funny moments. It's so inventive. It's a little also like Richard Lester's approach to the Beatles in the 60s. But he just shot and shot and shot and shot, and he shot way too much footage, and they never got around to finishing it. And that was Wells's problem, was just a lack of discipline. Although this was the most disciplined period of his life, because he had John Houseman imposing discipline, and until they had a literally flaming argument, because it involved Orson throwing flaming food at John Houseman. So Houseman was on the beginning of Kane and then left as it was getting going. But yes, Wells it's like he had too many good ideas, and just and never found the producing partner again after Kane, who would metaphorically sort of sit on and say, okay, it's done, we have to move on, or and of course he proved himself so completely with this film, showed that he was a great filmmaker, made a very daring follow-up movie that was not a really commercial choice, and struggled ever after, to have the same kind of tools.
And that's the Magnificent Amberson story is 3 hours in itself, just to explain what happened. But Wells certainly did extraordinary works after leaving Hollywood. But it would have helped to have a producer who could certainly herd him in the right direction. There is that line from Citizen Kane where somebody says, and I think they're referring to Xanadu, he never finished it. He never finished anything. And a lot of anti-Wellsians apply that to Wells. He did finish things, but there were unfinished projects and some focusing issues that created.
And I think that is a little bit of a Wells-ins joke, I'll just say, because famously on the radio, Metal nearly walked out on a broadcast once. He was so frustrated at how Wells was not, getting things together in time. Like, they went right up to this last second, and you can tell listening to some of the shows, they never timed it. They never did a full rehearsal. It kind of falls apart halfway through it, and he starts talking very slowly through the end of some of them because they just never figured it out. So I think even then he had a bit of a completion problem, and Richard Wilson, who was one of his producers and actors, said that the radio show was the best thing Wells had because it meant he had to have something finished at 8 o'clock,
There is something to be said for a deadline. And in fairness, there were I'm sorry, Daniel, please, you were going to say something?
I just wanted to sneak in another comment before we go to Q&A about the legendary stature of Greg Tolland. About sometime between 5 and 10 years ago, the ASC, the American Society of Cinematographers, which is an honorary organization that you have to be invited to join, they decided to create an app for working cinematographers' iPhones. And it's described as a digital assistant. And it's, for example, no matter where you are on the planet, you can calculate exactly where the sun will be at that day and time. Things that are useful for people who need to get into the weeds here. They sell it for $40, which is kind of pricey for an app. Knowing they had an uphill battle here, they named it the Tolland. I don't know how the sales went, and for that audience, people will pay attention.
That's amazing. Could we, before we get to Q&A, any thoughts to add about the actors in the film? And many of these were new faces, but they did continue on to other films beyond, had good Hollywood careers. I can add something on Wells, but go ahead, Stephen, on anything, some of the other actors.
Only to say the obvious, that Wells had a great gift for finding talented people. He adored Agnes Moorehead. He wanted her, incidentally, to star. If anyone has seen the film The Stranger that Wells later directed, Edward G. Robinson, who's wonderful, is a man hunting a Nazi. Wells wanted that character to be played by Agnes Moorehead, and the studio said, "No, we don't want a woman to be, the main character." So Wells was so progressive in so many ways.
And Joseph Cotten had a really distinguished career, starring in, The Third Man, a lot of Hitchcock's TV episodes. He was a very good actor and is probably not all that well remembered today by younger people, sadly.
But the following year, he will star in The Magnificent Ambersons for Wells, and that's going to put some strain on their friendship because the studio, while Wells was away, asked for reshoots that Cotten and others participated in, and there's an element of there was a little bit of betrayal Wells felt. But in 1943, Wells will star in what many consider Alfred Hitchcock's most famous, or Hitchcock's personal favorite of his films, Shadow of a Doubt.
Cotton Will versus Wells.
What did I say? I'm sorry.
Well, that's all right.
Actually, I heard a rumor that Wells was considered for that part at one point. So that was a partially historical Freudian.
Okay.
But yes, Joseph Cotten will appear as Uncle Charlie in Shadow of a Doubt.
Probably his most memorable role. I mean,
absolutely. And then you have Everett Sloane and you have Ray Collins, who will have strong character roles in the 1940s and 50s. Sloane will appear in Lady from Shanghai as Rita Hayworth's husband, who has a confrontation in the House of Mirrors. He has some powerful roles in the 50s as well.
And Ray Collins, for anybody who is old enough to remember the first few seasons of Perry Mason, he played Lieutenant Tragg, the sort of bad guy cop who was always in opposition to Perry. So we know him from TV as well.
And Paul Stewart appeared in quite a number of film noir, and he also appears in the last official Wells film, The Other Side of the Wind, which is worth seeing on Netflix. And then you had mentioned, Stephen, Dorothy Comingore being a victim of the blacklist. I believe someone asked in chat, was Orson Welles on the receiving end of the blacklist? The historian Joseph McBride made some important discoveries. Welles left the country in late 1947 as two of his films were still being worked on. And it is of McBride's theory that Welles wanted to get out because of the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings had just taken place. Welles had been traveling in a lot of left-wing circles. Had he remained in this country, he most certainly would have been at least called to appear before the committee or blacklisted. So
yes.
The theory anyway.
He was definitely being monitored by the people who were monitoring Hollywood actors. He's in a lot of paperwork about his liberal activity. Unfortunately, I think he alienated so many studio heads that he self-blacklisted, but that's another story.
Yeah, there were things he did well, and there were a lot of self-destructive traits, but he also had some really strong friendships with certain studio heads as well.
Like Zanuck, yeah.
Exactly. So there's so much we can say, but I know that there are members who would of our audience who would love to participate, and I will call upon Marianne to assist us with the I next on the 21st will be giving a talk on Hollywood, which Sean will tell more about later.
So if you want to ask question, please hit the reaction button and raise your hand. And right now I have no question. So, Joel, please, can you unmute and start your video? Joel Stiebel?
Yeah, I'm trying. Oh.
Okay.
We can hear you.
We hear your voice.
Okay, so Mr. Cahill, I don't want to put you on the spot, but didn't he do some other things that are not only depth of field, but had multiple mats and then compositely printed them? And maybe I think I saw something once about a lens that actually could have two different depths of field because it was an asymmetrical lens.
There is a lot, and the Robert de Keringer book talks about this. Daniel might be able to chime in. In Citizen Kane, there is a lot of what we would call, I don't want to get too technical, but optical printing work, where they're taking portions of material that were filmed and superimposing them in a way over other. They could be miniatures, they could be paintings, to create a certain image. And there was a lot of manipulation. Would you agree, Daniel?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Sadly, I don't know anything about the lens that Joel referred to. That's new to me, but I was trying to deal in a general way about how they set up scenes in their studio shoots, but there were plenty of, let's call them special effects, optical printing, lab work behind this. So it's not all as simple as it might look at first blush.
Like when Kane is, I mean, if one example is that when Kane is singing and dancing with the chorus girls and Mr. Bernstein and Leland are talking together, as I recall, that's one of the shots that is a very clever optical printing effect with Wells in the back, probably because they wanted the lighting to be fairly low. And it was just something you couldn't do everything in camera. Just film wasn't fast enough and you need too much light. But yeah, they're just so ingenious.
There's the one where Jim Geddes is in the balcony of the theater, and then there's a convention going on down below, and there's like multiple things going on in the convention at the same time.
Yeah,
he could never get that depth of field.
No. Oh, that reminds me. Just a quick thought about that scene, the political rally scene. All through the film, Wells is using what he does in radio with sound, because part of why we believe that's such a big space is that cavernous echo. And I interviewed the sound man, James G. Stewart, because he worked on a number of Herman and Wells films, and asked him about that. And I remember he told me that when he played the political rally scene for Wells, Wells smiled and said, "You're a bigger ham than I am."
But that shot that Joel mentions is an example, I think, of an optical printing work where the Ray Collins scene was separate from the materials of the rally, and through technology they merged them together.
And I have to say, that's one shot that kind of looks a little fake. You know, you don't really believe he's looking down on the scene. It's a nice structure and composition, but I think it's a little creaky in the special effects department. That's all.
It's true, but he doesn't linger on it, and then it captures the dramatic effect too.
Of course. No, it's well designed. I just thought it was not particularly well executed, but that's just me.
I would say it was Wells' design. Sorry, that was an obvious. I had to go.
Okay, thank you, Max.
Someone in the audience mentioned deep focus could have been an influence to Wells from his theater work. Absolutely. We think of deep focus, the forward and the background being in focus, enabling the movie audience, like the theater audience, to choose what they want to look at, everything being in sharp focus. Also, the low angles that Wells loved so much throughout his career. We think of the audience looking up at the stage for the first 4 or 5 rows. That also could have been an extension of the theater experience that Wells transformed to the cinema.
Sure. I mean, deep focus has been praised by, I think it was André Bazin, sort of a film philosopher, theoretician, who praised deep focus because it puts the audience in control of what they're looking at, rather than the director saying, "Oh, look at this detail over here." It sort of liberated audiences, and it was a little risky for a lot of directors, but
May I just briefly chime in and say, when Citizen Kane came out, Tolland had already been using this effect in films like The Long Voyage Home, and a lot of cinematographers in Hollywood did not like it, just as a lot of people in Hollywood didn't like Wells. They preferred the approach where they liked the way they were doing it, and they thought that Tolland had gone too far. So it's sort of sad to think that during his lifetime he didn't live to see the acclaim that this would get. I mean, he certainly worked, and it was appreciated within Hollywood and recognized as a great thing, but it was not like every cinematographer patted him on the back and said, "This is great." So a lot of them said, don't mess with don't change what we've been doing all these years.
There's a very competitive spirit between cameramen, and a lot of them are very guarded about their secrets and their tricks. And when something new comes along, a lot of people will frown and harumph a lot.
And then quietly copy it.
Exactly. I think of Gordon Willis in the 70s. He was nicknamed the Prince of Darkness, which was not always a compliment, but
And he was denied
prevailed.
Academy Award nominations by very resentful members of the ASC for that
Indeed.
reason.
Indeed.
But anyway, thank you, Joel, very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
John. Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Well, guys, I think that's it. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful talk back. I think it's an incredible movie and it's fascinating. And as you say, there's a lot we could continue to talk about.